Perfect. All right, great. Good morning, Matt. How are you?
Good morning. Good morning.
All right. Well, it's good to be here, and it's good to be with you. It's a beautiful morning, bright and sunny, and illuminating morning, and an illuminated morning. So
We'll have to take your word for it.
what's that?
I am just now waking up. I will have to take your word for it.
Well, take a look too. I suppose it's your right, and you'll see how illuminated and how illuminating the morning is. Okay, great. Well, today we're making up for lost time. We were unable to get together on Monday, and so we're doing Monday's talk. We're doing it today. And today we're taking on section 2 of chapter 25. Chapter 25 is the general law of capitalist accumulation. And its title, the title of this particular section is Relative Diminution of the Variable Part of Capital, simultaneously with the progress of accumulation and the concentration that accompanies it. This is a really interesting and a very thought-provoking section in the chapter because I believe it is useful for understanding the moments between the steady progress of history, if you will, the steady progress of capitalism, and then an abrupt transformation in a moment, a critical moment in history, and then a subsequent and elevated concentration of capital. Of course, that's what this chapter is about. In any case, before we begin and to talk about this particular section, Matt, won't you share with us just a few thoughts about your work over the last week or so? Maybe thoughts about your literature, thoughts about the literary world, just a bit general.
Just generally speaking, I've been working on the novel. I've also been working on another collection of poetry simultaneously, and so got a lot more on the way, on the horizon.
All right.
You get into that work mode, you don't really think about broader implications of the broader field or the you just keep swimming. So
yeah,
I don't have any thoughts about the literary world at this point in time.
Well, the reason that I asked this question is because I think I've had this conversation with you in the past.
Mm-hmm.
I know that I've had the conversation in other contexts, although I don't know if we've had it within the context of, the professor and the poet, or is it the poet and the professor? Anyway, that the work that you do as a writer of fiction, as a writer of poetry, the work that you do as an essayist, the work that you do as a poet on the stage represents opportunity for us to reflect on things that lead up to the moment, the continual reproduction of capitalist and racist and colonialist and imperialist relations, and your work as a poet, as an essayist, and so on, represents a clarion call. Represents an announcement, a warning, an alert to us, however poetically, that if we don't recognize history, if we don't recognize the past, shit's gonna get worse.
Yeah.
Shit's gonna get worse. So certainly your work fits, generally speaking, fits within the context of the discussion that we have this morning. So having said that, Senor, having said that, I'd like to just to let folks know that the terms that are presented in the book in general and the terms that are presented in chapter 25, right, are tools with which to build and not the building itself. In other words, these are tools with which to understand the past. These are tools with which to understand a future, a future under construction. But the terms are not the future, if you will. The terms are not the building. I think that those of us who get paid to understand these terms have a tendency to either forget this or, frankly, to continually promote the illusion that the terms are the building. So your work, Matt, is a reminder, not just to folks, outside of the academic world, but your work is a reminder, in fact, to folks in the academic world, right? That history precedes us, but if we're willing to take the risk, we can put history in our hands, or if we're willing to do the work, do the homework, and make use of the tools, we can put history in our hands. Anyway, I just kind of wanted to begin.
Right. And I think that, I think it's always important when you're reading Marx to understand that Marx was in terms of, wasn't just a philosopher, it wasn't just it's a writer, it wasn't just a theoretician. He was actually an advocate for something. He was actually pushing for something. He was actually fighting for something, right? And I think a lot of these things are very complex and whatever. But he was also propagandist, so he may come up with these like kind of flourishes and phrases like the philosophers have thus far only attempted to understand the world, the point is to change it, right? But years later, given the immense body of work that he's created, the study of Marx has become, in and of itself, something of a cottage industry.
Reified. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it gets reified. So the point becomes to not even understand the world, but to understand Marx, right? And it becomes you can make a career of not even understanding the world, but rather understanding what Marx meant in some small passage. And not even in Kapital, like in like the Grundis or something like that, some unintended published notebook. I figure out what he meant by this and what he meant by that, and then of course, other people are born and develop careers and do things and take things in a different direction. And oftentimes, it seems like the people that kind of follow in the Marxist tradition, who are the most obscure, tend to be the ones that that start thriving within the academy, right? So then you get Marx, and then all of a sudden Marx turns into Gramsci, right? Okay, so Gramsci's still kind of talking about the world, but then Gramsci becomes the Frankfurt School, right? And the Frankfurt School becomes Lacan and Foucault and etc. To the point where you don't even know what you're talking about anymore, and there's it becomes like these words. These words drip further and further from materiality rather than being tools to understand it.
As you're speaking, I'm reminded of a conversation that I had last week with a young woman named Darylyn Stewart. I don't know if she's with us this morning, but I had a conversation with a young woman named Darylyn Stewart. Who's concerned about the higher education of Blacks, and is concerned with, or rather, the politics, the politics and the ideologies surrounding Black consciousness, and the politics and the ideologies surrounding Black consciousness as they fit, as the consciousness fits within an objective history of capitalism, of a slave economy, and she proposed a question to me This is a young woman that's writing at the beginning stages of writing a thesis, and she says to me that, she's interested, and I'm paraphrasing here, but she's interested in keeping things relevant and meaningful from the perspective of her life as a student, and from the perspective of her life as someone gaining political consciousness, gaining an awakening, as someone who is committed to her community, and somebody who wants to promote, as she says, her community's interest. And I thought that this was a very interesting conversation. And then she summarized her thoughts about this, and I'd like to share this summary with you, Matt, so that you might respond to it. She said, I want to write a thesis, but I'm careful not to abandon. And I'm paraphrasing here because, of course, the conversation was last week, and I've had many conversations since. She says, I want to be careful because more than a pursuit of, more than the pursuit to become an academic, is my pursuit to become an intellectual.
Mm.
So there's this divide, on the one hand between the academic, and on the other hand, the intellectual. Thinking about this, and since you brought up Gramsci, I mean, this is why I think about this. I suppose we might say that the academic is the employee of this factory, this knowledge factory, this, that fits within the sort of capitalist relations that we've been addressing, this capitalist history that we've been addressing. And then there is the intellectual, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose that there are different strands of intellectuals. But anyway, your thoughts about this divide, your thoughts about this language, and your thoughts about this conversation.
Well, I mean, you can take the. I mean, it's such a weird question. I mean, it's not a weird question, but it's an odd question for me to answer, or it's a question that I may be too close to it to answer. You know what I'm saying? I may be like too close to the question to answer in a way that doesn't come across as very like jaded or cynical or something like this. Because I mean, if you like right now, like Cornel West, was very famous. Very famous for being an intellectual, for being smart, being this person that people look up to right now. However you feel about Cornel West and his work, it's a separate question. But the fact of the matter is that he is held in high regard as a public intellectual. Was just denied tenure track from Harvard.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of people that kind of float under the radar, under the current, right? And they have these jobs at places like Harvard, at Yale, at this, and they're compensated very well. There are tons of people who are making, $200,000-$300,000 as just admin at community colleges that you'll never hear of. There are all kinds of ways to make more money just being an academic or just being part of the general college machine by just like keeping your head down and not saying anything. Then there are other things in life, like actually having work that, reaches a lot of people and having it be impactful and really be something that has an effect on the world and affects the way people think and affects the way people talk and affects the things people think about and affects the things people talk about. And that's an intellectual. You don't have to be in the academy to do that. And it helps to be in the academy to do that. And but you don't have to necessarily. And those people, oftentimes, you'll see floating from job to job to job, facing, economic precariousness at times. I mean, sometimes it's well rewarded. Someone like to figure like Noam Chomsky or something like that. He bounces from place to place is fine. And Cornel West is gonna be fine. But there's other people like Stephen Salyata, the Palestinian writer, George Sekarel Lamar. He got fired from Drexel for a tweet. Which they would deny, but that's pretty basically what happened. So there's all these kind of people that kind of get they get fired for their convictions or at least the way in which they express their convictions or something. I don't know. And so, but those people are intellectuals. Those people are intellectuals, public intellectuals, widespread intellectuals. And if that is what you seek to do, is to have an impact, then yeah, those are two different. Those are really different. Those are very separate and distinct. The reason I say I be cynical about it is because, well, why do you want to be an intellectual? I mean, you want to be intellectually famous, to be rewarded, to go places where people know your name and clap for you, and I don't know why I'd be cynical about that, because that's my life. Because,
Healthy suspicion.
Well, I get cynical about it because I see that people do get rewarded within that framework, within that where, and it becomes its own little game, right? It becomes its own little game about the whole public intellectual thing. It's like, okay, I'm not doing this for money. I'm not doing this for a 401k. I'm not doing this for a dental plan. I'm not doing this for blah blah blah. I'm doing this for some higher truth, and then that tends not to be true either. So it tends to be a whole other game within that game. So, but if your starting point is, I want to be an academic, an intellectual rather than an academic, that sounds like a really good place. That sounds like a good starting point. It's when you start going down that road and start, navigating that. All these other weird questions start coming up.
Well, you have to bump up. You have to bump against the sides as you're making your way forward. The academic has to make her way, or the academic has to make his way, and bump up against, the politics of intellectualism, how that is defined, given one's ties to the community, given one's, in my case, for instance, one's links to the Chicana and Chicano community. In Darylyn's case, her links to the Black community, right?
And then community organizers are often the biggest assholes imaginable. I mean, they're the most tight, provincial, just these holy cows, these holy saints that can never be criticized. Yeah. Oh my God, people are unbearable. So so I said that. Prado didn't say that. I said that. So so it just it presents its own challenges. Is what I'm saying. It presents its own challenges.
Yeah. All right. Well, so this sets the the very general context, the very general parameters for our discussion this morning, and we better hurry up.
We better hurry up.
We're almost halfway. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to begin in reverse, Senor. I'd like to begin in reverse. So that we can work our way back to it by way of the discussion. And what I've done is I've selected a quote, a tool, right? I've selected a tool to share so that we might discuss it as we make our way towards and return to the objectives of our work. Marx writes in the second to last paragraph, he says, the masses of capital amalgamated overnight by centralization reproduce and augment themselves like the others, only faster, and thus become new and more powerful levers of social accumulation. Hence, if the progress of social accumulation is mentioned nowadays, it compromises, as a matter of course, the effects of centralization. The additional capitals formed in the course of normal accumulation serve mainly as vehicles for the exploitation of new inventions and discoveries, or of industrial improvements in general. However, the old capital likewise arrives in due time at the moment when it must renew its head and limbs, when it casts off its old skin and is likewise born again in its perfected industrial form, in which a smaller quantity of labor suffices to set in motion a larger quantity of machinery and raw materials. The absolute decrease of the demand for labor necessarily following therefrom will naturally be so much greater the more these capitals going through the process of rejuvenation have become accumulated in masses by means of movement of centralization. I'm reminded of two things, and I want to ask your thoughts about this, and say whatever it is you'd like to say. First off, of course, is the obvious, machinery and industrial improvement, technology, inventions, etc., right, serve to harness the economy, serve to harness the authority of capital in industry, and serve to harness the authority of capital over labor, right? So that's one thing that I'm thinking about, and I don't know where it was. I heard this just recently. It might have been in conversation with you, or it might have been in conversation. Shit, it might have been in a meme. I don't know. Right? That the past has a sneaky way of propping its head up again in the past. I'm sorry, in the present.
Mm.
Right? No matter how much we try to rid ourselves of the past, it props itself up again. Anyway, so those are two things that I'm thinking about, and I'd like to ask you either about those two things, or I'd like you to respond to this quote.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that what we talked about, like, this is in earlier chapters we talked about, capital being dead labor, and what did that mean? I think that was such a startling statement that capital is dead labor, and I think that we can see how, like, the deeds of yesterday, like, show up on the plate today, right? So kind of like you reap so kind of stuff, but in a very mangled by exploitation. And I think what Marx is talking about here is he's talking about, because there's a tendency to there's kind of a natural tendency, and then there's like the manipulative tendency, right? So the natural tendency is to see something in front of you and then extrapolate, that all that you see is the meaning of everything, right? And that you're looking at something in front of you and you're like, okay, even if you were to take it to just like an individual, interaction, like, this person is yelling at me, this person is mean, I don't like them, they're a bad person, right? So, and that's the end of it. But in reality, there's a whole slew of reasons as to why that person is yelling, that has to do with their chemical balances, that has to do with, like, past experiences, that has to do with their immediate reason, that has to do with, like, an interpretation of your actions, an interpretation of their actions, an interpretation of how they feel conflict should be managed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's all kinds of reasons that are going into this. So again, when you look at the world in front of you, there are all kinds of reasons as to why things are happening, right? So we talk about what Marx is describing here is the fact that it's not just like this individual relationship between a capitalist and a worker. So this individual relationship between one individual capitalist who's growing in their capacity. It's a whole field, of a whole section of capital that's growing, that is allowing these things to happen. So, and then it's allowing individual capitalists to then centralize their operations. So yeah, and so when we're talking about in our time, what does it mean when these things, when we see like these greater and greater and greater concentrations of wealth? I mean, I don't know. I mean, like I don't think we actually know what the hell's going on right now. Like, I don't think we really understand what's going on right now, because really, Elon Musk, he's jumping up $20 billion every day and then losing $20 billion the next day. And he's doing that on a product that doesn't make any sense, because it's not that Elon Musk isn't a billionaire, or wouldn't really be a billionaire in the traditional sense. It's that he wouldn't have that much money other than the fact that he's Elon Musk and people kind of think that's cool, and that rises in the stock market, because he's not really selling that many cars. He just isn't. He's just not selling that many of these luxury items. He's not selling that many commodities to have that much money. But Jeff Bezos is. Bill Gates has a monopoly on an operating system that is in every computer, or not every computer, but in half the world's computers, or over half the world's computers. So that makes sense that these guys have these incredible amounts of wealth. It makes absolutely no sense that Elon Musk has the wealth he has, and why it jumped.
Yeah, it's logical that they do, given the economic circumstances. But
right. It's
criminal. It's criminal that they do.
It's evil. It's logical,
Yeah.
why they have that money. It's completely illogical as to why Elon Musk's fortunes jump 10 billion one day and lose 20 billion the next day and then jump back the next day. It is illogical why Zoom at one point in time was valued as higher in the stock market than Exxon. Exxon had done like something like $90 billion in business in a time period, and Zoom had done $2 billion in business, and yet Zoom was being valuated higher than Exxon. That makes no sense. We're during this whole period of COVID. I mean, the entire world economy probably should have collapsed. It probably should have collapsed, but it's being propped up because, like, in this period of time, where labor is being so far divorced from the capitalist, from that, that CMC thing that Mark's
Yeah.
talking about. Since we're being so far divorced, since we've been divorced from that for like 30 years, or the process of uncoupling after like 30 years now, um, everything's a bet. It's a house of cards that eventually is going to crumble. Eventually, it's going to crumble. I mean, we saw in 2008 almost crumbled, but it eventually will crumble, and it's really increasingly based on nothing. It's really increasingly based on nothing. So, as to, like, what does it mean, in our times when we're looking at what Marx is describing? Marx was describing a complicated, large, but evil, but logical system that had an internal logic to it, that it made sense. What we're living in is a sham, is a card game, is a way to protect the market, independent of this older relationship. I mean, today in the United States of America, in the majority of states, the number, not the majority of states, but the number one leading job in, I think, like 20 states, so like half the country, is a truck driver. So the jobs of tomorrow never came. I mean, it's a truck driver in almost all the countries. Other places, like a nurse. So these are jobs. I mean, and I think in Washington, one of them's like a computer programmer. So like one out of 50 states, you have these, like, the jobs of tomorrow is the leading job, or the most common job in that country. Most places is truck driver. Half the country is truck driver. Retail workers, another big one. Nurses is another big one. So you have all these different things that are holdovers from the industrial economy, because there are other jobs that did not make it, and these jobs are the ones that are holding on. These are anachronisms. These are dinosaurs that walk among us, and eventually they too will fall. And so this is the comet struck, and we're living. This is the survivors of the comet. And that comet was automation, and these things are still around, but they're going to die off too, eventually from the smoke, from the fallout. Uh,
Yeah.
these jobs will get
Yeah.
automated. People, and the technology exists to automate these things. People just don't want to, because they're more like, oh my god, there's technology to put a computer on your face, but most people don't want to walk around look like a cyborg, right? That's why the Google Glass failed. But there is technology right now to automate truck driving. Absolutely. It currently exists. And you know
Yeah.
what? It'd probably be safer at this point in time. I mean, it would probably be safer. I mean, yeah, people would die, and an automated truck would kill them. But people died a year right now, and not just from truck drivers, but from anybody just driving around in cars and smashing into each other. Yeah, if you automated all automobiles, yeah, there would be less deaths. There would probably be less deaths.
No.
People
Yeah.
driving, people tired driving, people distracted driving, people texting while driving, just people just
Why? Why would? Why
all those
would? Why?
things.
Why would? Why? Why would somebody who is? Um, why would somebody with your intellectual leanings and you or anybody else? So I'm not necessarily just asking the question about Matt Sedillo. I'm asking the question about folks that, though critical of technology, though critical of, or rather critical of the tools, um, uh, when the tools are seen as, the be all and end all, right, are nevertheless uh, uh, open to the possibilities that these tools represent, given the future in store. I mean, that's a long-winded and perhaps unnecessarily wordy way of saying or asking the question. why would folks believe that technology is safer than human manipulation of a steering wheel?
Because I'm not a rube. I mean, I'm not stuck to these things. I mean, like, if you read Marx, right? Marx talks about all the time about alienation, about how people are gonna be really. This is, I mean, this is one of the most profound things that I just disagree with him about. He writes about, like, like the charm of the cobbler, the charm
Yeah,
of starting from start to finish, and like that. That's what. Now I know you yourself work on like carpentry. You
yeah,
yourself have you laid bricks and you made your own barbecue from start to finish, and you have this other rewarding profession that many people would want to be, which is a college professor, and this is something that people would like strive for,
yeah,
and would be like, oh, I would kill to have a job like that. Or, like, it's not just well compensated. It's also something that like is a job that is awarded a certain amount of respect in society that many people would strive for. But you would rather be, or not necessarily you'd rather be, but you also are very passionate about doing these little projects from start to finish, like building a birdhouse, building a chair,
yeah,
building this, building that. And so for you, that means a lot. And I think for a lot of people, it does mean a lot to, like, tend a garden, to
yeah,
really see that from step one to step through, and they see the thing through, right? But people also take a lot of meaning in their small division of labor in a larger system.
yeah,
People draw meaning from that. Like, like, okay, well, if it weren't for me, like, you may mock me, but if it weren't for me, these many bottle caps would not have gone this, and the babies would have been drinking out of the bottle. Like, I'm the one that puts the nipple in the bottle and twists it like this, and like, if I put 10,000 there, that's 10,000 babies drinking good milk, and I had a small part in it, and I helped raise these, and they're all my children. So you get these people, they get these ideas about, they get very romantic about their piece in a larger
yeah,
assembly line.
yeah, it's true.
They learn to love their position in the assembly line. They draw a meaning from their position in the assembly line. They see something there, right? Well, so what does this tell me? Well, this tells me that people draw meaning from life, period. They draw meaning from their life and their activities and the things that they do. So in the future, when cars are driving themselves, which is going to happen eventually, like, maybe not in my lifetime, but it's going to happen, if there's a world that doesn't burn. Um, that's going to happen, and planes flying themselves, and this doing this, and people talking with like glasses that are computers on their face, and all these things are going to happen, and they're going to still find meaning, and they're not going to be alienated, they're not going to hate themselves, they're not going to be like, oh my god, who am I? They're going to find meaning in it, so they're always going to find meaning in it. So that's why I think that the technology, it is what it is. I mean, look how we're talking to each other right now.
Yeah,
Is this alienating? Is this horrible? Does this like cheapen my life? Does this cheapen yours? No, but would we imagine, would we not think this weird when it first happened, when it first began, when people first started talking via computers like this, seeing images of each other like this? It's not seen as like a bizarre thing, like, whoa, it's like almost having a face-to-face meeting, but they're actually in different rooms. We
yeah,
don't even think about it. Now I'm starting to think about the fact that I'm here in my room, you're there in your room. Now I'm starting to think it's weird.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Now I'm conscious of it, but
Yeah,
like, but I'm not conscious of it 90% of the time. I mean, I'm 99% of the time.
yeah,
I'm not. I wasn't conscious of it till I mentioned it a minute ago.
yeah,
So the fact of the matter is that we don't really think about these things. We just do them. So that's why I embrace the concept that technology is moving forward, and we're gonna have to just move with it.
yeah.
But
I
but we need to own it. I mean,
and that's where I was about to I was about to get there, because um, so the interesting thing in Capital is that Marx was and in other things that I've read outside of Capital, that Marx was fascinated by capitalism, its productivity, its innovations, its inventions, and its transformations, and its capacity to cultivate consciousness in ways that hadn't been possible before.
Mhm.
So I mean, I was very interested in this. And the thing is that it's to the extent that well, as you say, we become the owners of technology. And it's to that extent then that we are also cultivated, as we've been cultivated over the last 200 or 300 years. You know, women's more integral presence, for instance, in decision-making spaces. Uh, Certainly, the our presence in stations where levers exist. Your presence, Matt Sedillo, my presence, Jose Prado, in places from which we had been excluded before. However, it's to the extent that we own these technologies, given the kind of cultivation that we've experienced, it's to that extent also that we'll have the opportunity to open up free time for ourselves, and not just to be the owners of technology, but to be the owners of our freedom, the owners of our free time, so that we can be what's the famous quote? I don't know if it's in, I don't remember reading it in Kapital yet, but maybe it's in some other reading. Be a farmer in the morning, a fisherman in the afternoon, and a scholar in the evening, or something along those lines, right? That technology is going to provide these opportunities. Certainly, when I read the press, the international press, when I read the press, for instance, coming out of Cuba, right, I know that this is the way that they're making sense of their adaptations and their integration of digital technology in their society. However embattled they are with capitalism, and however embattled they are following the fall of.
Well, see, I think that Marx attributed a lot of the innovations of his time to capitalism, right? But I also think that was incorrect. I think that what it was the innovations of industry, of technology, period. I mean, it wasn't really necessarily the individual. Yeah. It wasn't. I mean, it was individual capitalists that were implementing. It was individual capitalists that were doing. It was individual, industrialists doing different things, and it was under the political shell of these capitalist economies that these things took place. So of course he's going to associate all these rises with capitalism. He says, and for a brief time the capital shall innovate the world, and and for a brief time, he almost encouraged capitalism at times. I mean, especially human angles. I mean, they would say things that basically for a brief time the capitals will have. I forget the exact quote, but they're talking about how capital would for a moment have their basic moment in the sun and usher out the age of feudalism, and then the socialism shall follow capital, right? But then when you see the Soviet Union, I mean, that's not exactly what happened. I mean, there was never, Russia was what Marx would describe as kind of semi-feudal, and what ended up happening, with aspects of capitalism throughout its major centers. But what ended up happening instead was it ended up that the socialists were the ones who industrialized, who ended up industrializing the Soviet Union, right? So it was the socialists who did it. So that's the Soviets, they industrialized the Soviet Union, and so and so it took a very different shape. I mean, and I remember talking to people who had been to Russia, and they talked about going into these factories that would be 1 minute like a car factory, and then next the next week or even the same day shipped over to like a bike factory, right? Because it was planned by the state. So it was why waste a piece of real estate? Why waste a good factory? Why build this? So it was because the aims and goals were different, the actual implementation turned out different. So there's nothing inherent to building of bicycles that demands that one person own all the surplus value of all the labor. There's nothing inherent to all these things that have to be centralized into monopolies that the people here are describing in the comment section. The fact of the matter is that the technology in and of itself does what it does. So the Soviet Union, for its faults, for its greatness, for its whatever, Cuba for its faults, for its greatness, whatever, they cannot launch people out of laser beams to the moon and teleport people like Star Trek or something like that. It's not possible because it's not physically possible. Not because there's something wrong with the economic system. So the world of what's physically possible is determined by technology. The world of who has access to what's physically possible is determined by politics. It's determined by political struggle. And so these are two separate questions.
Yeah.
And so when I think about technology, I think that we can embrace the fact that technology is moving in a direction that's moving to a decreased need for human labor in order to it's not like the necessity of a division of labor so that we can have a high standard of living
Yeah.
is decreasing. The fact that we can live well and have like air conditioning and have and be able to move 60 miles in 60 minutes, all those things that are that improve life or whatever, that can happen increasingly without people having to go and sacrifice their backs and their arms and their lungs to factory work. And that's happening at an increasing level. And where it is now, it will not be in 10 years and in 20 years. So we need to embrace that process. But at the same time, we need to own the means of production, because if we don't own the means of production and we are simply pushed out of labor, then we're going to starve to death.
Well, I think your the verb that you use needs to really be cemented in our consciousness, and the verb, of course, is embrace. Literally, we need to embrace those things, not just here, but here. Absolutely. We've got 10 minutes, and there's a note that I had for myself concerning the direction of the conversation, where I'd hoped we'd be by this point, and I don't know if I'm going to have time to get into it, but I certainly want to talk about the political / and economic implications of this greater accumulation and this greater centralization. In other words, as I was reading this chapter, this section, I was thinking about the fact that I hadn't really read about the financialization and the rise of creditization as an element to facilitate the greater political authority of the financiers, the greater and the greater existence within an economic context where there are less and less and less people working. And I was thinking about the fact that while we are within, we exist in a historical moment where this is the case, and we exist within a historical moment where capitalism, of course, is able to reproduce itself on the basis of credits, on the basis of a debt economy. And I was thinking, I really haven't read this yet in this book, and just a few pages into the section and thinking about just this matter, what do I read? I read the following, and I'd like to share this thought with you, and let's see how far we can get into it before we bring poetic closure to our discussion this morning. The laws of this centralization of capitals, or of the attraction of capital by capital, cannot be developed here. A brief hint at a few facts must suffice, he writes. The battle of competition is fought by cheapening of commodities. The cheapness of commodities depends, all things being equal, on the productiveness of labor, and this again on the scale of production. Therefore, the larger capitals beat the smaller. It will further be remembered that with the development of the capitalist mode of production, there is an increase in the minimum amount of individual capital necessary to carry on a business under its normal conditions. Smaller capitals therefore crowd into spheres of production which modern industry has only sporadically or incompletely got hold of. Here, competition rages in direct proportion to the number and in inverse proportion to the magnitudes of the antagonistic capitals. It always ends in the ruin of many small capitalists, whose capitals partly pass into the hand of their conquerors, partly vanish. Apart from this, with capitalist production, an altogether new force comes into play. What is that? What is that force? The credit system.
Wow.
So I don't know how much more, because I haven't read chapter 25 completely, but here is language only now introduced as I can think about it. But of course, reading about primitive accumulation and the antagonisms between the bankers and the producers, I suppose this now makes a little more sense. But anyway, what are your thoughts about this and
Well, I mean, if you look at it,
privatization in culture? Yes. No, go ahead, please.
I mean, look at the amount of debt people have taken on over the last 30, 40 years. I mean, again, this all takes place over the same period of time that the homelessness, explodes, that the cost of education explodes,
Yes.
the prison population explodes, that explodes. This all takes place between the 70s, like 78 now, right? So also, just coincidentally, when automation really started destroying the factories. I mean, this is really the shape of a new society, because people need to buy commodities for the market to keep going. People cannot afford to buy commodities. So what happens? That's when the credit and the credit debt explodes. It's extended. I mean, did it exist before? Of course it existed before. It didn't come out of nowhere, but it did not exist as it existed after that. And so. Yeah, I mean that's the world we live in. I mean, we live in a world of debtors, and it has not always been that way. It has not. It's not just that people were just better off. They knew how to manage money better, or that people were less desperate, or the times were easier. It's not that. It's just that you could not get this much into debt because no one would allow you to get into this much debt. As to the way things are today.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking about a couple things. The reason that this is a matter that really speaks to me is because in conversations that I had with my grandfather was born in 1905, and as a consequence of the pandemic that was raging through Mexico during the Mexican Revolution, my grandfather became an orphan. He and his 11, or rather 10 brothers and sisters became orphans. And this is, just at the moment, my grandfather was about 7 or 8 years old. So this was literally within the middle of some of the most violent periods that were sweeping Mexico at the time. And his older brothers, as he shared with me, went with Pancho Villa. They went to fight with Pancho Villa to combat the system of debt servitude that miners in mining towns found themselves in. In other words, they were beholden to the mining company for existence, for food and such, for clothing and such, and thus indebted. They were controlled by the mining companies in the state of Durango and in the state of Chihuahua, and certainly in other parts of Mexico, and certainly in other parts of Latin America, and here in the United States as well, right? In any case, my question for you, and perhaps you can bring some poetic closure somehow, such that you answer the question, I don't know. How is it that debt has the capacity to embrace us, hold us, and people that are the architects of debt? How does that happen? And then what is our response what is our response, to this oppression? What is our response to this pressure? And of course, I'm thinking about my grandfather's older brothers.
Yeah, well, my great grandfather, he grew up. He was he grew up. My grandfather grew up in a mining town in Colorado. Very very similar, very very similar thing. My grandfather came from Mexico to do that, and then they got swept up in the Mexican Repatriation Act, and they got pressured to leave. I mean, the exact story as to whether or not they officially were like forced out or just like it's time to clear the fuck out. It's kind of blurry, but anyways, they left during the Repatriation Act. So, so yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I mean, like that's kind of part of family lore. The company towns. I mean, but see, what we're talking about is a little different though, because company towns were isolated. That's not how life was in like the major booming metropolises as they were growing up and up. Right, that was something that was like isolated. These places where you had these like captive workforces that you could just further throw them into debt peonage. I mean the other systems, the sharecropping system, people keep talking about St. Patrick's Day, so the Irish tenant farmers probably a lot of it's actually based on the Irish tenant farming system that English colonists learned doing that, and later would turn that into the company town here in the U.S. As well as sharecropping system. So it is a long history. So how do we get out of it? I don't know, man. Shotguns. Fuck you, we're not paying. No, I don't know, but that's how they did in the past. I mean, that's how you're talking about going Pancho Villa. You think about the fights. You think about, especially think about coal. Even in this country, the fight over coal in this country was one of conflict. I mean, it's really basically. I mean, it's basically we're not going to pay you. I mean, and if you look at like, and I'm a joke about shotguns, but seriously, like this is this simple refusal to go along with the system. That has really been the way. It's a simple refusal.
Poetic closure.
Poetic closure. You know what? I'm gonna do this next week. I'm gonna share a poem because I don't have time to do it this one. I'll do a poem right now, but I'll do a shorter one. Okay. Next week I'm gonna share a longer poem. And if you can guess all the songs that are made reference to in that poem, I will give you a free book.
All right.
The reason is because everyone's talking about today's St. Patrick's Day and just different things. Yeah. And that poem kind of would touch on some of it touched on that and a lot of other things. But this is a poem. You asked me what I'm up to. This is the first opening poem of the book. The new book I'm working on called Elon Musk Must Be Stopped. Okay. And it starts about the early days of what Marx referred to as primitive accumulation. So it goes like, when presented gifts, they severed limbs, shipped children, cracked the heads of infants against a stone, then demanded more by sea, by sword, by disease, by design, genocide, first charged ashore, sailor. It's your first time around, captain. It's all you have to offer, the blood, the blade, this new crusade, this human plague, this beast that walks upon two legs, opening chapter, its original sin, all this not long after. First contact.
I'm reading... just before we close, I'm reading, Set the Night on Fire, that Mike Davis book, and the portion of the book where there is an attack by the police at the Century Plaza Hotel, I think it is, and what you've just shared is in fact what took place. I guess it was in 67, 68 or thereabouts. Men, women, and children were beaten with clubs by the LAPD. Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, we'll see you next week. Hopefully we'll meet on Monday.
On Monday. See you next Monday.
All right. Bye-bye.